This is Ramon Begoudi, Senior Counsel at Borden Ladner Gervais in Ottawa. I'm here with Stephen DeBoer, former Canadian Ambassador to the World Trade Organization. And this is the Tariff Home Companion, a new podcast to shed light, not heat, on trade and tariff issues affecting Canada and Canadians. We're back to talk trade. In our first outing, we discussed the CUSMA. This is the free trade agreement President Trump negotiated with Canada and Mexico in his first term, an agreement that replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the NAFTA, and was supposed to provide a solid foundation of secure and predictable trade for the three parties for decades to come. It was not to be. In our second episode, we explored the World Trade Organization, a multilateral trade institution that was the culmination of a 40-year post-war project, an American project, to establish rule of law in global trade and economic relations, and to advance security and predictability in international commerce. For all its promise, that project has also had to scale back its role and ambitions. What's Canada to do? Last time, we talked to a former Canadian trade minister and former WTO ambassador. We saw that throughout its history, starting before Confederation, Canada has had to grapple with two competing visions. One, driven by economic necessity, by geography itself, spoke to closer integration with the United States. The other, motivated in part by a strategic need to avoid dependence on one market, no matter how big, no matter how friendly, sought a third option. The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and the NAFTA were a specific repudiation of the third option as a principal policy objective. But, and this needs to be emphasized, both liberal and conservative governments since have pursued diversification as a desirable outcome. That's how we ended up with a healthy, though not excessively ambitious, network of free trade agreements. We're back to explore diversification, and we're fortunate to have two energetic and visionary political figures with us today. Stephen and I will, as usual, provide a bit of background. We will then ask our guests to walk us through the possible, the probable, the realistic, the good, and perhaps the unattainable perfect outcomes. Let's go back to the basics. To be very simplistic, trade has two directions, import and export. Both are important for a healthy economy. There are things that we can produce. There are things that we need to produce, the goods we produce. And then there are things we could produce, but probably shouldn't, because simply Canada's highly educated workforce should be working on high value added stuff. Trade also has two components, goods and services. When we talk about tariffs, we're talking about imports of goods. There have been times when Canada and other countries have imposed taxes on exports of goods for various reasons. Then there are services, and the whole import-export issue gets a little bit more complicated. Because to begin with, all goods have some sort of service component. When a bunch of radishes is harvested, right there's a service. So is washing it, and packing it, and distributing it, and transporting it, and selling it. As some goods have more of a service component, because it's in the news, we can think of movies. The physical reel, of course, is a good, but clearly the value of a movie is not in the physical good itself. Import, export, goods, services. Add intellectual property, and it all gets really complicated. Tariffs capture the value of a good as it crosses a border. But there are all manners of other things that cross the border that tariffs do not address. I mention this because we will be talking about trade in goods, but we need to bear in mind that there is a massive other sector, services, that's right there, in which the United States has a healthy surplus. And that is not talked about as much. The US also earns money through foreign direct investment and intellectual property. These inflows also do not make it, at least not fully, into the trade statistics or into the discourse. Import, export, goods, services, capital, intellectual property. So far, so good. Well, perhaps not yet. There's one more thing I want to talk about because it inflects the Canada-US trade discussion and any talk of diversification. And it is the notion of value added. When we export a good, how much of that value stays in Canada? You remember I mentioned the highly educated Canadian workforce? Now to the numbers. Let's zoom out to the global numbers because they tell an interesting story. Last year, Canada's exports of goods and services were around $950 billion. Services were about a fifth of that figure, while imports reached about $1 trillion for the first time. Let me break this down a bit. Mining and oil and gas extraction were the largest driver of economic growth. Travel and financial services significantly contributed to overall export growth as well. Three other broad sectors were significant: professional, scientific and technical services, information and cultural sectors, and financial and insurance in the services sector. Then you have agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, and they remain important elements of our international trade. I hear the gallery. Yes, but tell us about tariffs. We'll get there. These are Canada's top 5 goods export by category. The first by far is oil and related products. The second is autos and related products. Then we move on to machinery, things like nuclear reactors and boilers. Fourth goes to precious metals and stones, and then electrical and electronic equipment. You will see that nearly 2/3 of this figure is natural resources. What about our imports? Here are the top 5: autos, machinery, electrical and electronic, oil and related products, and plastics. Right off the bat, you will see that the vast majority of this batch of imports is manufactured products. So we sell primary goods, other people work on it, and then they sell stuff back to us with a premium. I exaggerate, but that essentially has been the pattern of Canadian trade throughout our history. Okay, so where do we sell our goods? The numbers are striking. Over the last 10 years, 97% of Canada's crude oil exports in value went to the United States. We can expect some change to this as the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion comes online, though likely only on the margins. Already in 2024, 6.1% of crude oil exports were to non-US markets, up from 2.8% the year before. In the month of October 2025, as much as 70% of crude oil departing from BC was headed to China. Trade with the Asia-Pacific region suffered a decline in 2024, but it's picking up again in 2025. As for other markets, we're seeing a considerable expansion of exports to the EU and the UK. Imports up 8% in January 2025 to October 2025. Exports up 22% in that same period. Then we see increased in trade activity in smaller markets in Central and South America, and also in Africa. Imports from Africa up 42%, exports up 20%. So this is the stuff that we already produce and sell. But what about prospects? The biggest of these prospects is liquefied natural gas, or LNG. This is natural gas that has been cooled, compressed, and liquefied for transport. LNG has become a focus of interest, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and the potential risks for Ukraine's European allies of losing access to Russian gas. Major terminals are in the works in BC, facing Asian markets. There's talk of terminals out east to serve European interests.
Thanks, Rampat. As we now turn our focus to the future, it would be useful to set out some of Canada's efforts to continue to facilitate and encourage trade, both domestically and internationally. In the first place, it's useful to review the internal changes being made to propel domestic trade. On June 30th, 2025, the Government of Canada announced that all remaining federal exceptions from the Canadian Free Trade Agreement will be removed. So a list that started with 53 exceptions or barriers now reads 0. So what drove the extinguishment of these exceptions? It really came down to procurement and a goal of allowing Canadian businesses to have an opportunity to become more competitive nationwide. In 2023, more than $530 billion worth of goods and services moved across provincial and territorial borders. This represented almost 20% of Canada's GDP. Removing barriers to increase these numbers even further were, of course, important. Now, when we're talking about internal barriers, we can really break things down into 4 categories. These are natural, prohibitive, technical, and administrative barriers. Natural barriers include geographical barriers. I think it's easy to understand those in the Canadian context. The mountain ranges in Western Canada and the sheer geographic breadth of Canada spring to mind. Prohibitive barriers include provincial or territorial laws that may unintentionally prohibit internal trade. For example, restrictions on cross-border purchases of alcohol. Technical barriers would include something like vehicle weight standards, which are sector-specific regulations that may differentiate between provinces and territories. And finally, administrative barriers include provincial or territorial permits, licensing, and other paperwork requirements that may be imposed on businesses operating in multiple jurisdictions. Now, more than ever, the need to encourage domestic trade is paramount. For example, and for some of our listeners, this may pique their interest, internal trade ministers from 10 jurisdictions have agreed to an MOU committing to advance direct-to-consumer alcohol sales. This would give consumers the ability to order their favorite Canadian wine, spirit, beer, or other alcoholic beverages directly from the producer. Provinces and territories are working towards finalizing detailed agreements by May 2026. And finally, as we are lawyers, we can't forget to mention Bill C-5, the One Canadian Economy Act. The Act received royal assent on June 26, 2025, and enacts the Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act and the Building Canada Act. The Act will expedite nation-building projects and continue to remove federal barriers to internal trade and labour mobility. The Government of Canada will consult provinces, territories, and Indigenous rights holders to identify projects of national interest under the Building Canada Act. Projects will be evaluated based on criteria such as strengthening Canada's autonomy, resilience, and security, economic and other benefits, likelihood of successful execution, advancing Indigenous interests, and supporting clean growth and climate objectives. The goal is to accelerate nation-building projects while ensuring environmental protection, Indigenous rights, and economic opportunities. All of these measures seek to further develop and facilitate internal trade. However, Canada is, of course, not done there. I will now touch on some of the external measures the country is focused on. As we look ahead to the 2026 Olympics, it would be wise to discuss Team Canada. Although we won't be taking a deep dive into medal hopefuls, we will discuss Team Canada trade missions. These missions are large-scale, minister-led missions, including to the Indo-Pacific region. And as Rambod touched upon, this is a prominent market for Canadian trade. The missions prioritize innovation sectors where Canada has a competitive advantage. Team Canada trade missions aim to develop or to help open doors for Canadian companies, both large and diverse, and small and medium-sized enterprises. There is a specific focus on those owned by 2S LGBTQI+ individuals, Black and other racialized Canadians, Indigenous peoples, women, and youth. These missions strive to provide these businesses with access to business and government decision makers, on-the-ground trade support from Canada's network, valuable market intelligence, and opportunities for growth and visibility. The program consists of visiting one or more countries over 1-week periods and spending an average of 2 days in each city. Participants will learn about doing business in the host market and gain exposure to their social and business cultures. Another service available to Canadians is the Trade Commissioner Service. The service looks to provide expert trade advice to Canadian businesses to help them expand and exceed globally. The service also offers funding, missions, and support at trade events. Notably, Canadian companies that partnered with the service during the period of 2000 to 2022 achieved 20% higher export value and reached 20% more international markets. The service supports exports, foreign direct investment, and science, technology, and innovation. The Trade Commissioner Service helps Canadian businesses grow internationally by providing tailored advice, market intelligence, and connections through a global network of trade commissioners in over 160 cities. To support exports, the service offers advisory services, market assessments, qualified contacts, and problem solving. It also offers a funding program to Canadian exporters, covering up to 50% of costs up to a maximum of $50,000 to help small and medium enterprises enter international markets. To encourage foreign direct investment, the Commissioner Service assists global companies looking to establish or expand in Canada. It supports this mandate by providing market intelligence, site selection guidance, and connections to local partners. To help Canadian innovators take advantage of global opportunities, the service may connect businesses with international partners with access to cutting-edge technology and facilities, global value chains and investors, and funding. Much like I discussed with the Team Canada's trade missions, the Trade Commissioner Service will also organize trade missions and facilitate business-to-business meetings as well. The goal is always about relationship building and exposure to international opportunities. As we previously discussed, the current state of free trade agreements in Canada and what got us to this point, we wanted to take a minute to turn our minds to the future. What's next? Well, just recently, on September 24, 2025, Prime Minister Carney announced the new Canada-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. This will be Canada's first ever bilateral trade agreement with an ASEAN country. This agreement will eliminate or reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers, create a more transparent trading environment, and open new opportunities for Canadian workers and industries. These opportunities will open us up sectors such as clean technology, agri-food, infrastructure, and financial services. This agreement will eliminate or reduce over 95% of the tariffs that Canadian exports to Indonesia, are currently subject to. And the goal is to finalize this agreement by 2026. Furthermore, on November 1st, 2025, Prime Minister Carney announced the initiation of free trade negotiations between Canada and Thailand, a huge step to unlocking even more opportunities for Canadian exporters. And this follows an announcement in December of 2024 of the launch of exploratory discussions for a free trade agreement with the Philippines. Our previous episode touched on the golden age of free trade agreements, and hopefully this is a sign of that era continuing. Canada has shown its desire to continue facilitating free trade among countries with which Canada has both existing and new relationships with, and, as we said last time, supporting its economy one free trade agreement at a time.
We're fortunate to have with us two important figures in trade policy in Parliament. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. Adam Chambers is Vice Chair of the Standing Committee of International Trade of the House of Commons. I had the pleasure of working with Adam closely on a number of projects dealing with financial services when he was an advisor in the office of the late Jim Flaherty, the then Minister of Finance, and I was General Counsel at Finance Canada. Yasan Harvey and I go back to the early 2000s when he was teaching at Ottawa U Faculty of Law and invited me to give a talk to his class on trade remedies. He then went on to serve as the Attorney General of Ontario before moving to federal politics. He is currently the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of International Trade. Adam, no, sir, many thanks for your time this morning. I know this is a busy week. Really glad you could make it. So we heard a lot of numbers. We heard a lot of options. Let me lob a really softball question at both of you at the outset. If we have limited resources and if we're pursuing diversification, do we invest more in trade agreements or do we expand the kind of support that we already have, for example, the Trade Commissioner Service or EDC or other the Federal Crown financial institutions?
Shall we start? Sure. I think we do all of the above. I think we have to do everything. But I'll take the discussion at a macro level, because I think where we find ourselves right now with the level of protectionism that we're seeing in the United States is that countries like Canada have a choice to make, whether they pursue the Donald Trump theory of economic prosperity, which is to close borders and impose tariffs like the way we used to see before we engaged in free trade agreements, or we continue on the path where we open more markets by signing free trade agreement. I'm of the view that Canada is going to do the latter, where we continue on the path of finding new markets. So trade diversification does, as a policy objective, becomes an imperative. So I think these choices are important choices. And for Canada to pursue in paths of signing agreements with ASEAN countries, Mercosur, we're negotiating, which I mentioned, to finalize an agreement with Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand are next, are extremely important. But in addition to that, agreements only provide only one set of objective, which is market access. And all of us who've been involved in that line of work, we know they're important. But then the trade facilitation piece is extremely important. And that's where trade commissioner services, trade missions, et cetera, on the ground, making sure our businesses, especially SMEs, have an opportunity to then access those markets, take advantage of those market access that have been negotiated through agreements, is also imperative. So my view is we do both. And at this moment, we double, triple, quadruple down on both those directions.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for having us. It's great to be here with one of my fellow colleagues and friends. I would say in terms of limited resources, I think it's one thing to have a number of trade agreements, which we do. You mentioned in the lead-in, we're lucky we have a number of agreements, many of which were started under Prime Minister Harper and then finally, brought into final negotiations by previous government or the subsequent government of Prime Minister Trudeau. I would say it's one thing to have the agreements and another one to use them. It's one thing to have the market access, but if no one is actually using it, I think that's where we should be somewhat concerned. And I would say, I'm not sure the numbers of trade diversification over the last, say, decade or even 20 years actually show much of a diversification. It has come down a little bit from the US, from height, but I would say that there's still a lot of missed opportunity with facilitation in the markets with which we have trade agreements. And just use the budget as an example. I think there's about $4.4 billion of new money for expanding Canada's trading relationships. $4.2 billion is for trade infrastructure, ports, railways, etc. And the remainder, about $200 million, is for the facilitation piece. So I would say that's probably not necessarily large enough. And then for what you have in existing trade facilitation, how are trade commissioners doing their jobs? What do they view their role to be? If you ask them, what are they supposed to do every day when they wake up? How are they compensated? What is the right metrics that we're going to use to judge them? I think that has to all be part of the conversation. And I'm not familiar exactly with how trade commissioners are managed globally, but I would ask questions like that in order to try to frame this facilitation piece as being incredibly important.
Well, we happen to have a former ambassador to Poland with trade commissioners in his office.
So a couple of I tend to agree actually. What I think we see here, tend to agree with you, Adam, is that what we see here is that we've been very good about negotiating agreements. Canadian businesses have not been very good about taking advantage of them. One of the advantages, I suppose, that is now turned into a disadvantage of being so close to the US is it's been easy to export to the US, and it's a little bit more difficult into the EU, for example. So when we look at the Canada-EU context, it's the EU that's trading more with Canada than Canada with the EU. So there is a Trade Commissioner Service role there for sure. But also to your point, Adam, maybe this is a time to rethink how the Trade Commissioner Service does some of their work. I find it fascinating, for example, that the Trade Commissioner Service in Europe is still organized around member state lines when in fact it's one single market. So it shouldn't matter for Canadian companies whether they're selling into Poland or whether they're selling into Germany. It's all Europe. There obviously there are some market differences, language being the most notable, but still, so I think there probably is scope for changing or rethinking how that's being delivered. I'm really curious to know if I can ask a question here. I'm really curious to know, when you're talking to your constituents, is trade and trade diversification an issue? Are your constituents engaging on this issue? And if so, what are their views as to what Canada should be doing?
That's a good question. I represent the riding of Ottawa Centre, a lot of public servants who live in my riding, a lot of people who work in associated areas. So it may not be 100% reflective of everyday Canadian in many respects. So it's always an important disclaimer. I think conversation comes up, especially nowadays, as we try to navigate our relationship with the United States as to how else Canada economically could grow. I was canvassing, knocking on doors. I just on Saturday, not that expecting an election coming up or anything. Thought I inject that. And so that was the conversation, right? Always negotiations with the United States going, what else are we doing? I think there is a recognition that we just cannot solely rely on one country or one economy. And Canadians do recognize that we have way too many eggs in the US basket, that we need to do things differently. And we've been talking about trade diversification for a long time. This is not new. I think what they're hoping that this time it's going to be real, that we are able to expand our non-US export trade. So I think having a goal, as Prime Minister Carney has put out, to double the non-US exports in next 10 years is an important target. I totally agree with the point you're making. It's one thing to have these agreements. Are you really how are you making sure that those channels are being utilized is where we need to spend more time from a trade facilitation purposes. Big part of it, as I'm in my role as Parliamentary Secretary of International Trade, is I'm finding that businesses are just starting to open their mind to other markets. It's just so easy to do business with the Americans. It's close, same language, pretty much the same currency. And when you start looking at places like in Indo-Pacific, where you have to travel 24, 25, 26 hours to get there, and then you have to build brand new relationships, and that won't just happen in one trip, it will take multiple visits. People are saying, oh, I'd rather sell to Milwaukee. And I think we need to focus on that aspect as well. And of course, government has an important role to help open those portals or channels to make that happen.
What are you hearing, Adam?
I break it into a couple different types of interactions. You'll have individuals who are, working in the economy, not necessarily working in an export business, but, regular everyday Canadians. They would, by and large, not object at all to trade diversification. Hey, it's a great thing. We're signing new trade agreements. if you talk to some business owners, I think you can also separate those into a couple of categories. Those who are heavily levered or connected to the US market already, who are very concerned about, not 10 years from now, but like 10 days from now or 10 months from now. And I would say the message from those individuals is, hey, great, it's a nice opportunity to maybe sell my wares in Indonesia, but what would be great is if we could just sort this out with the Americans. That would be, my primary objective, like they would say. Then there's probably some other business owners who are maybe newer industries, maybe they're in the services sector. They're open to trading with other nations or making their services available, but they don't quite know how to do that yet. And I would say in my area, we've got a mix of, we have a heavily industrial kind of auto parts type feel to a lot of parts of the riding. So there's a serious anxiety related to what's going to happen on certainly the auto sector because of the ripple effects it would have across the region. And then also some agriculture. Well, one of the challenges in agriculture, labeling is a big issue in particular as well in Europe. And if you think about Canada's market and then these provincial bodies, they all have different labeling requirements. Europe has one standard, and the fact that the entire agriculture market in Canada is not one homogeneous market. That's maybe why you don't see these people taking advantage of some of the opportunities in Europe, because they're not just one Canadian market, it's another 10 separate markets all the way along. So I would say I'm hearing a mix of reactions. I would say, though, in particular in my area, people would like to see the situation with the US resolved to some degree, whatever that looks like. Is there some kind of certainty we can provide? What's the right number? Are we going to actually ever get a deal? What's that look like? So I would say that's the totality of the reactions I see here.
Let me zoom out a bit and maybe focus on not sort of the means of diversification, whether it's the trade commissioner service or more trade agreements, combination of both, and so on, but the what. And just put this thought out there. There is the last substantive point I made was about LNG. So that seems to be a consensus no-brainer, that going forward, this is the kind of thing that if we can get a national consensus on pipelines going, then maybe that's something that we can start developing. But we're still in the natural resources thing, right? And that is developing more LNG pipelines may or may not help manufacturers in Simcoe North, right? Certainly not whatever manufacturing capacity we have in Ottawa Center. Is there a path you see that we would be able to diversify, not so much away from natural resources, but into more manufacturing and more services exports?
So the question is there a path? Absolutely, I think there is a path, and I think you have to look at like the one that would absolutely be zero controversy would be agriculture. The fact that Canadian agricultural products are not only sought after, but generally viewed as high quality. And for those of you who think that, still care about emissions, you can ship Canadian wheat around the world 4 or 5 times before it has the same carbon footprint as a similar product in another part of the world. So I think we have a huge opportunity in agriculture. But you mentioned, other manufacturing, but services, which is another reason why, being close to the US is a little bit of a double-edged sword. There's a lot of, you can hear the sucking sound of the individuals who want to go and build like a tech startup or a business in the US just because of the market, the access to capital. But if we can keep those individuals and entrepreneurs in Canada, especially in the new economy, artificial intelligence, or just building a business on, you know, that you can serve the globe, but from, say, in the tech space, if you can keep those individuals and that talent here, then I think that's a huge opportunity for export as well. And there are some really great Canadian examples of that, including here in Ottawa. And Ottawa has an actually pretty good history of technology companies, global technology players actually being based and growing right here in Ottawa.
And that's the point that I want to pick up. In the intro, you were talking about our top 5 exports, and you talked about the goods. And we are, yes, still, we have to admit, we're very much a natural resource based economy. And that's why so much focus, if you look at the major projects that have been announced by the Prime Minister, are really still focused on those natural resources, whether they're mines or LNG, et cetera. But I think with the evolution for Canada has gone, and you spoke about the talent, is our people. We're a small country, but we're highly educated, talented people. I often say that our best natural resource is what's between our 2 ears. And that's where I think we need to focus more on. So when you talk about Ottawa Center, yeah, we may not have manufacturing, but we have got lots of services that are being produced here. And I think that as a contributor to our GDP is an important element. So if you look at the ICT sector, the information and communication technologies, that is a big sector, and we can do even more here. AI, which is sort of the new revolution that's coming. How is Canada positioning itself from that perspective? This is where we get into conversations around data centers and how much energy we need to fuel those centers. This is where I think really the other pillar of our economy really lies, is to leveraging those people, attracting the talent from around the world that can create those value-added services that the world needs. And we can be really not just be the hewers of wood or oil or water as we were, but actually the creators of these technologies as well, and the services, where I think most of our urban centers and those populations get their economic well-being.
I don't necessarily have a question, but I found it really interesting. One of the things that Adam had to say when you talked to your constituents, I think amongst the trade wonkery, if we want to call it that, there's we all seem to accept that this is the moment where our relationship with the United States, our trading relationship with the United States, is fundamentally changed. But what I heard you say is that there is still a segment of the business community that is hopeful that this can be resolved with a view of sort of a status quo ante, where we can go back to where we were before. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. It just is not necessarily in step where I think trade policy folks are necessarily sitting. And I don't know whether that's magical thinking on the part of Canadian business, or whether there's actually a bit of realism to that. But I think it's interesting for policymakers to be aware of that dynamic.
Yeah. Well, it may not be that they believe that we could go back exactly to what it could be or what it was previous. I think the question is, the current limbo state is obviously not going to be forever. So the faster we kind of get to, and now, it's been we're going to come up on a year on this. The faster we kind of get to some kind of resolution will provide at least some certainty, and then some decisions can be made about, okay, here's what the field looks like. Am I going to invest my time and resources in trying to maintain the relationships with the US? How does that change the economics of my business? Should I be looking at other markets? What's that look like? I think there's just a desire for some certainty around that. And, the election was primarily fought around the relationship with the United States. Yes, it may be changed forever, but I think the current state of that relationship is not one that will exist forever. So I think there's just a desire for people to say, look, we would like to get this sorted out one way or the other. We see other countries making deals. What's that look like for what would Canada's look like? Are we going to be at a disadvantage of anybody else? If we get a deal that, doesn't put us at a disadvantage versus any other country, then, is that okay? Like maybe we could live with that. What does that look like to our economics? I think that's the desire that you hear from the community. So they're maybe not wishing, I mean, sure, people wish we could go back, but there's a realism that says we'll get a solution at some point. We just have to try to get there.
This is the case of where two things can be true at the same time. We've got that great geographic advantage, which we've drawn a huge amount of prosperity by being neighbors to the United States. The rest of the world was always envious of us that we had this massive continent, unprotected border, a free trade agreement, integrated supply chains, and how well we've been able to use for our prosperity. Of course, we have to work really hard to preserve that. And I think that's one of the effort. How can we preserve the elements of CUSMA that still works for all of them? And we're still in a good place where CUSMA compliant goods has zero tariff attached to it. And again, better deal than the rest of the world. We got to work hard on the sectoral piece, and we will get there. Adam and I, part of the International Trade Committee, we're doing a review of CUSMA right now. And more or less what we're hearing from stakeholders who are coming in saying, find a way to preserve this. This is good for us. But the second part is we shouldn't just pour all our energy in just doing that. We need to explore the other world because the rest of the world is also feeling jilted by the Americans and now looking for new markets. So there's a whole new imperative where in the past, everybody wanted a deal with the Americans. Now people are looking at everyone else. It's interesting how in this whole conversation, we have not talked about China and India thus far, because that whole dynamics have created a different imperative when it comes to China and India. And look, Canada is almost being pushed to go and engage with China and India and find opportunities so that we have access to newer markets, growing markets there.
And China and India were, in fact, examples provided by Sergio Marchi at our last session. And in fact, it's funny because just today I saw reports about Switzerland expanding its existing free trade arrangement with China. The arrangement they entered into in 2013, and they're expanding that. And of course, that's coming 3 days after they presented the bar of gold and the gold Rolex in the White House. So that raises a couple of questions. The first one, and I mean, we still don't know what the actual terms of the agreement are between Switzerland and the US. That apparently the text is going to come out in July 2026. That's what we're hearing. Who knows? So the first question, to go back to the point you raised about the agreement, we have now texts from Thailand and Vietnam. Now, those are, of course, they're not quite in the same power relationship with the United States economically, but at the same time, they're the only agreements we have. They give us a sense of what is expected. And we're going to be writing an article about that to explain them. There's not a whole lot of analysis, unfortunately, in the Canadian media about those agreements, just so that everyone has a better sense of what these agreements can look like. But they for lack of a better term, they are very much capitulation agreements. They, for example, they require the grant of concessions to the U.S. on services trade equal to anything any of those countries enters into with another country. So a unilateral MFN concession. they freeze U.S. Tariffs at the same time as they require those countries to drop whatever measures they have in terms of information security, data centers, and so on and so forth. So again, very lopsided in that way. And they have annexes that commit, for example, the one in Malaysia commits Malaysian multinational companies to purchasing, X amount of US goods. I'm just wondering, again, not that that is the final shape of that would be the final shape of a Canada-US agreement. We've seen that announcements have been made about investments by Japan in the US, that Japan very quickly withdrew, that purchases by the EU, that the EU very quickly said, I mean, that the commission may or may not have made concessions, but when they went back, they were told that that's not feasible. We still don't know what the Swiss commitments are in terms of either investment or purchases. But I'm just wondering whether even those interests, and I hear those as well from my colleagues. The US is our biggest market. We should get an agreement. Fair enough. Even those interests who are pushing for an agreement, would they be willing to live with those kinds of commitments that we know now they're in a text?
I think you're asking a very good question. I think it's a question that these individuals should be able to make with the full information. But we actually don't have much information about the discussion or transparency about the negotiations. For example, if there is a deal on the table, if it's a bad deal, and the reason why we still, we're 9 months into this and we don't have one is the reason because in the government's view, it is a bad deal. I think the fact that we're this long into the negotiations probably should be a little bit more transparency to let people know, or the market know, hey, listen, there's a deal on the table, but it's not very good. Here's what it looks like. And here are the trade-offs that we're being asked to make that we just don't think are in the best interest of the country. But the government's actually not saying that. The government's actually just not saying much of anything. We've had some very good testimony at our trade committee from a number of individuals, but a couple stand out to me. Mr. Steve Orhule, who's well known to you, I'm sure, and many folks here are your listeners.
We worked with Steve
Yes.
exactly 30 years ago
Right.
on the supply management case.
Right.
Yes.
And so I think, one of his suggestions, which I think was very reasonable for the government to consider, is, look, we're into this for a fairly long time. We know we have NAFTA discussions coming up, or CUSMA discussions coming up. If we try to continue to separate sectoral tariffs and then NAFTA or CUSMA discussions, what could end up happening is Canada could be asked to continue to make concessions at multiple different junctures along the way, where alternatively, if you said, look, we have all these issues, we got NAFTA coming in, let's put all these things on the table, we might be make fewer discussions at fewer concessions at the end of the day, by having one kind of broader discussion with America versus, individual negotiations, each by sector. Canada doesn't actually have many concessions to make, I think, is part of the challenge. And so that was an interesting alternative viewpoint, suggestion that I think could be made. But I think there's an issue around transparency. If we don't have a deal because the deal being offered isn't a good one, I think, now is probably the time to let people know what, the reasons for which. And I get, you're negotiating, it's a difficult, and you want it to be confidential. But I think we've also heard testimony says, we know a lot less about this discussion than you have about other ones with other countries or the Americans in the past.
I think I was just going to say, I think the fact that I'm reading tea leaves here, but the fact that Trump called Canada nasty suggests that Canada's not capitulating along the lines of Vietnam or Thailand. But you're right, we don't have a line of sight on that.
And that's the point. And that's the point exactly I was going to make, that these are very sensitive negotiations, and what we are learning are quite volatile as well at times, right? Small gestures, acts, even by sub-level governments within Canada, can put these negotiations in jeopardy. So one has to be really mindful. The other thing we also know is Prime Minister has been very clear in saying that a deal has to be good for the United States, but it has to equally be good for Canada. So we have a marker there in place that it has to speak to the economic advantage for Canadians. And we're not just going to sign an agreement for the sake of signing an agreement. And the last thing I think, which is extremely important, is to maintain the CUSMA advantage, which we cannot ignore. 85% of our goods that are being exported to the United States are tariff-free. And we should be thankful that all parties are following the agreement, with the exception of some sectoral stuff. And so we have to preserve that as well and not throw that, because that will be even a huge economic disadvantage to us. So I think this is the straitjacket we find ourselves as we are trying to negotiate with limited set of concessions. I agree with Adam, to get to a place that hopefully brings us as close to where we were before these tariffs were starting to be imposed on Canada.
You raised India. So I would really be fascinated to hear your views as to whether we think this is a good idea to be pursuing a free trade agreement or closer economic relations with India. The international trade minister has just come back. I understand the Indian trade minister, Goyal, is coming here in the new year. Is this the right approach, or is there an argument to be made that we're sort of ditching the values-based discussions that we used to have? I mean, this is not that long ago that we had a pretty significant diplomatic spat with India that hasn't quite been resolved as far as I can understand. But are we comfortable across the aisle on pursuing closer economic ties with India?
I think India and China both, there's a significant change in geostrategic realities. We have to take that into account. We cannot be pursuing trade diversification and not look at two of the largest, fastest growing economies in the world. We, of course, have to be very mindful as to how do we perhaps compartmentalize our economic prosperity and growth versus other security related issues. And I think that is the delicate balancing act we have to do as it relates to both India and China. And I think that's what the Prime Minister, when he's met with the Chinese president, has articulated. Same thing, the conversations that Minister Anand has had with Indian counterparts, and now Minister Sidhu's recent trip. I say all this in making sure that we're finding those right pathways. I think in the end of the day, Canadian values around respect for rule of law, around human rights, that's an overarching umbrella that's always going to be there, and that's always going to shape our thinking and our negotiations. But they cannot just be the only piece. We need to find a way to balance those. And again, not an easy answer, but it's where we find ourselves to be the reality is in this world right now, and we have to be able to engage in that.
Do you agree with that, Adam?
Look, I would agree in the general sense that we ought to be thinking about all of our options. As it relates to India and China, if I was to rank them, I think I would say that a deepening or fixing a relationship with India is probably more of an objective than one from China at this instance. I know that obviously the agricultural sector and relationship with China is incredibly important. I think we also have to just recognize that in the geopolitical world, where the U.S. sees its largest enemy as China, or its largest threat, maybe not full enemy, but a threat. And I think China recognizes that Canada's role is not necessarily at an equal playing field with where they view themselves as China and America, but that China views Canada as kind of like this middle pawn that it is trying to use to disrupt China's primary nemesis, as in America. So I think we have to be conscious that we may be being used as a tool to disrupt the military and economic supremacy of America to benefit China. So I think, while it has some promise, I just think we have to be aware of that potential. I don't see the same risk per se on the geopolitical level as I do with India and China in terms of that this being caught in the middle of these two large global powers, being the U.S. and China. I think India may represent an opportunity that doesn't come along with it, that other dynamic that we need to be mindful of.
One last question, and only because Mr. Lutnick was on Fox News last week, quite animated, ripping into Canada for the enormous harm we're doing to the U.S. movie industry. A bit of disclosure, about 20 odd years ago, when I was at the Trade Law Bureau, still with the Government of Canada, the United States proposed to slap countervailing duties on Canadian film because of the subsidies we had. And so we went to Washington, and I, being a subsidies wonk, I said, so what are you going to impose duties on? The film reels, the negatives, the value of the film, or the intellectual value that's in the film? I mean, anyway, the conversation was highly technical, really inconclusive, and at the end of the day, the Americans dropped it. Partly because, despite the fact that at the time Jack Valenti was frothing at the mouth against Canada, everyone realized that we all benefit. That, for example, Battlestar Galactica was being filmed in Vancouver. So now it's back in the news, and it seems to have animated quite a lot of angst, shall we say, in Washington. So very quickly, should we just cut off all subsidies to the film industry and make the Americans happy the same way we got rid of the tax credits?
Was the expression goes, we've seen this movie before.
Brew.
Well, look, I'm really mindful that we just cannot get worked up about everything we hear on the other side. It's just volatile. And we just have to keep calm and carry on, as the saying goes. We need to obviously focus on what our job is to protect our cultural industries. Remember, we had that whole thing too under NAFTA. I remember writing a piece, peer-reviewed piece on the periodical case.
Absolutely.
And what it meant, and the pushback from the Americans as it relates to that. So these challenges are not new in our relationship. We've dealt with them, but we've dealt with them because we've always talk to each other. That has been the strength of this relationship between Canada and US, is two rational parties talking, of course, from their own self-interest perspective, but using the tools available to them in a rules-based context. What worries me at a macro level is the protectionism we're seeing is just checking away the rules-based system. The uncertainty that Adam was talking about that business is facing is precisely that. The idea behind these trade agreements was not to have free trade. We never got free trade. It was liberalized trade. But most importantly, we put rules around how we will engage in those trades, because then businesses could plan and figure out a way to make a profit. We just need to find a way to get back there, whether it's the cultural sector, in movies, or selling cars to the United States.
There's two different components to the film or television industry. There's the actual, like the making of the product itself, and then who owns the IP. Well, in many of these circumstances, guess who continues to own the IP? They're American, large, multinational, global behemoths. Well, and you can list them all here. We all know who they are, the streamers, the amount of money that's gone into production is staggering. It's never been a better time to be, a couch surfer, Netflix connoisseur, because you've been able to watch pretty much anything you want, unlimited. Most of that IP that's created actually ends up being owned by Americans. So I actually think it's just another example of the Americans in particular, with Mr. Lutnick, using anything they can to justify a delay of the negotiations. And I think it's because the current status quo in kind of this situation we find ourselves, not having a deal, actually benefits America more than it benefits Canada. And you can connect it to the television ad by Premier Ford. Whether the ad was the right ad or not, or the right timing or not, I think maybe besides the point. I think it would, if it wasn't the ad, it would have been something else that the Americans would have used to say, well, we don't want to talk, because they know that the longer that there is no deal, the more uncertainty there is in the Canadian business community, the more likely it is that someone might grow a plant in the US, which is why, again, you circle back to a desire to try to get things sorted out with the Americans in a more quick basis. As I said before, the election was fought on like actually getting a deal. So, it would be great if we could sort that out. And if we can't get one, then I think we should be transparent with the public about what trade-offs we're making, or what sectors we actually are knowingly allowing to feel the brunt of not having a deal.
Thank you. And that was bringing back the IP issue was really good, because it connected us with the opening segment of this podcast. This brings us to the end of our session. Stephen and I would like to thank Yasser Nagvi and Adam Chambers for being with us. Finally, a project of this kind requires a lot of work to bring together. In particular, honorable mention is reserved for Alex Zutis, our student, and our producer, Jason Chud, and of course, the entire technical staff of BLG. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.